In today's video, we'll explore how living systems, from individual cells to entire neural networks, communicate through information. We will look at how this biological language encodes instincts, emotions, and motivation, among other types of information, and what the future of AI, as well as humanoids, can and might learn from this type of information processing and information exchange. This topic sits at the heart of symbiotic intelligence, the idea that the future and next generation of AIs, as well as humanoids, will not come from mimicking the human logic only, but incorporating it as a whole. By examining how cells, as well as neurons, encode, decode, and adapt to biosignals, we can begin to imagine an AI system that not only thinks, but also senses, responds, have intuition, have motivation, and emotions like we humans do. When Claude Shannon published his mathematical theory of communication in 1948, he was not thinking about the brain, neurons, and living cells per se. He was actually thinking about telephones, signals, and noise instead. Yet, his theory of how information moves through a system ended up describing something much, much deeper, a universal principle of communication that nature had already been using for billions of years. In Shannon's world, a message is transmitted from a source, encoded into signals, sent through a noisy channel, and then is decoded at the receiver's end. The goal is to maximize information transfer and minimize the uncertainty that the information carries. It is clean, it's mathematical, and yet it is abstract. But inside a human body, the same logic applies in a way that it beautifully communicates that information at a physical level as well. Cells, as well as neurons, are doing exactly that, not with bits and wires, but with molecules, ions, as well as electrical. And so, to understand how living systems communicate, we can think of every cell and every neuron as both a transmitter as well as a receiver. The encoding step happens when an internal state, such as lack of oxygen or a burst of excitement, changes the pattern of molecules or electrical signals that the cell sends out. The channel then might be the space between between these cells, or the neurons, the bloodstream, or the synapses between neurons. The decoder then is another cell or another neuron equipped with receptors or ions channels that can recognize these patterns and respond to them accordingly. At first glance, this looks very mechanical, like a chemical telephone network. However, the magic lies in how biological systems add layers of meaning and feedback. A signal does not just travel one way, it loops, modulates, as well as adapts. The sender and receiver continuously reshape one another, in other words, forming an ever evolving conversation that keeps the organism alive and adaptive. In cellular communications, molecules act as symbols. Hormones, neurotransmitters, ions, and growth factors all serve as part of the vast biochemical vocabulary. When a cell, for example, releases calcium ions in a rhythmic burst, that frequency and amplitude encode information that another part of the cell can then interpret, triggering specific genes or enzymes to activate. The same molecule can mean different things depending on timing, concentration, as well as the context where it's happening. For example, ATP in the cell's energy currency inside, but outside the cell, it can act as a danger signal, meaning it is not fixed. It's contextual and dynamic. Neurons add another dimension, which is the time dimension. They communicate with electrical spikes that are almost identical in shape, yet they convey enormous variety through their timing and their pattern. A neuron does not use words, it uses rhythms, the oscillations. The rate of firing might represent the intensity of a stimulus, while the precise timing of spikes across many neurons encodes the texture, tone, as well as the spatial structure of an experience. In the brain, the real language then is the pattern, not the pulse. Different regions of the brain have evolved their own dialects. For example, the visual cortex encodes images through synchronized firing. The auditory cortex uses timing codes to represent pitch and rhythms. The limbic system, on the other hand, including the amygdala, encodes emotion and instinct through biochemical modulation that shape perception itself. In this sense, emotion is not a byproduct, it's actually a part of the code itself. It is a weighing function that tells the system what matters most at that particular point in time. And so when we talk about information in the brain, we are not talking about discrete words or binary sequences. We're actually talking about statistical codes, probability distribution of spikes, molecular concentration, as well as oscillations that together reduce uncertainty about the world and the environment. The brain does not deal in literal messages. It deals in correlations, timing, and patterns of likelihood. This is where Shannon's mathematics meets biology's embodiment. Now, scientists have identified several of these biological code forms. In neurons, for example, there are rate codes where the average firing frequency represents signal strength. There are temporal codes, for example, where the meaning lies in the timing between the spikes. There are population codes where meaning arises from the combined activity of many neurons acting together. And there are chemical codes where neurotransmitters and neuromodulations add context and tone, much like emotional inflection in a speech. We already know that the alphabets of life, such as the nucleotides in DNA, the amino acids in proteins, and the ions and neurotransmitter in cells, exist. But what we still struggle to decipher is the grammar of it all. Biology uses the same letters in endlessly adaptive ways. The same molecule can carry entirely different meanings in different tissues, for example, or at different times of the day. There is not a fixed dictionary, so to speak. Instead, meaning emerges from networks and feedback loops that interpret signals relative to internal states and environment of the biological system. And that is what makes biological communication so powerful. It is not static, it is a living language. Every signal both transmit information and changes the system's capacity to understand future signals. This recursive adaptation is what gives rise to learning, memory, emotion, and instinct within the living organisms. Now, thinking about the modern AI language models, they process text as opposed to molecules. So that's a big difference between artificial versus biological systems. The training data comes from words and patterns of human speech, not from biological signals. Yet, in principle, they operate under the same framework of encoding, transmitting, and decoding information through patterns. What they lack, however, is embodiment, the grounding of information of physical experiences. In humans, for example, emotions and instincts emerge from continuous feedback between the brain and the body. The amygdala, hypothalamus, the brainstem, and so forth are constantly translating these biological signals, such as the heart rate, respiration, hormones, emotional tones, etc., into shaping these thoughts and decision makings of the individual. Without this grounding, information is actually very flat. It has no urgency or no motivation or no meaning beyond its structure. And so potentially this is where the biological signals become potentially essential for the future of AI as well as humanoids. In AI systems, if they are to ever understand or simulate genuine emotion, motivation, logic, intuition, and the human intelligence that we all possess, they will need to assess to embody these feedback loop, which happens in the biological systems, signals that tie information to survival, to context, and to the internal state as a whole. In biological systems, the body is not separate from the mind in actuality. It is part of the computation itself. By studying biological signals from neurons and heart rhythms and all the other areas of the biological system, such as hormones or micro voltage fluctuation, we can teach, for example, the future of AI system a new kind of intelligence, one that is not purely symbolic but symbiotic in nature. An AI that can interpret biosignals could, for example, learn from these patterns of physiological changes as well as physiological signals that are being constantly sent within the living organism. And the language of cells and the language of neurons, it's not the words itself, but the dynamic pattern that encode these type of adaptation. Shannon, in this case, showed us that information is the reduction of uncertainty. Biology shows us that the meaning is the reduction of danger, instability, or disorder. If the future next generation AI can learn that distinction, if it can read the emotional and the instinctive nature of the biological signals that give information its human weight, then they may evolve beyond more pattern recognition into something closer to living systems understanding and logic and intelligence. And so the next generation of intelligence of humanoids will not just process data, but will interpret biosignals or any signals for that matter in context, where it feels the impulse of its own feedback and will learn the language that life has been speaking all along, the silent statistical poetry of the cells as well as the neurons. I linked the paper that I partially talked about in this video, where the author talks about information processing and information science in general, of course naming Shannon, so you can read for yourself. But the other parts that I talked about in today's video was a lot about what we mainly talk about in this channel, where it's about the artificial systems versus the biological systems and how they could potentially evolve in the future. I hope you found it useful. Thanks for all your likes, comments, and shares, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.